Next slide, please, Lucy. Disclaimer, this presentation was produced and funded in whole with federal funds from the U.S. Department of Education under contract number GS10F0112J with the American Institute for Research, AIR. Carolyn Limpia serves as the contractor officer's representative. The content of this presentation does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the U.S. Department of Education, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial products, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. Again, welcome to today's event. Now handing it over to our moderator, Marcella.
Thanks so much, Long, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for our session on trauma-informed practices in adult education. This is part of our LINCS Universal TA Wednesday webinar series. Today is December 1st, 2021. And just as a reminder, today we will be together from 3 to 4:15 p.m. Eastern. And for those of you on the West Coast, that's 12 p.m. to 1:15 p.m. So just a reminder that we do have that extra 15 minutes as part of today's session. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our Universal Technical Assistance webinars in case you're not familiar with them or today is your first time joining us. Today's session is part of, as I said, our LINCS Universal TA Wednesday webinar series. This monthly webinar series is on topics that matter the most to the field. So these are supposed to be ideas to be in service to you and to help meet your needs. We intend to support states in building their capacity around important topics. And in case you have to drop off early, if you have other colleagues that you'd like to share this webinar with who unfortunately aren't able to make it, or if you'd like to refresh yourselves of the content of today's webinar, all of our webinars are recorded and available on the LINCS YouTube channel. Have a little bit of patience as we get those uploaded. It does take a little bit of time, but they will be there soon so that you can review those there. Next slide, please. Before we got started and before I turn it over to today's wonderful presenter, I wanted to share with you a couple of LINCS resources, specifically 3 groups that we have in the LINCS communities where you can continue today's conversation. Long put in the chat the link where you can access all of those, but they are our program management group, teaching and learning group, and disabilities and equitable outcomes group. And all of these, we've already had some conversations on related topics related to trauma-informed instruction. And so I encourage you to go to these groups to continue and build on what you learn in today's session. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm very excited to welcome today's presenter. Our presenter today is Lucille Rosario, MSW, LICSW. She is part of the Direct Equity, Culture, and Climate team for Minneapolis Public Schools. But beyond that, she is a licensed clinical social worker. She has a master's of social work degree from Columbia University. She's a practicing clinical social worker and has been for more than 15 years in Mexico, the Bronx, and in Minnesota. Within those positions, her roles have included district program facilitator for climate and culture. She's on the faculty at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. She's a senior fellow at the Minnesota Institute for Trauma-Informed Education, a founding member of REACH, which is a mental health support group for refugees at the US-Mexico border, trauma therapist and trainer, supervisor and manager at a domestic abuse organization, and a school social worker and a specialized school serving that highest needs students in Minnesota. In addition to that, she's also the proud mom of 2 kids and 2 dogs. She's amazing. I'm so excited to have all of you listen and learn from her as I have. So Lucy, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome and thank you for being here today.
Great, thank you, Marcella. All right, we will get started.
So before we dive into content, I would just want us to spend 1 to 3 minutes to breathe and ground. On the screen, there's an image that is just going inhaling and exhaling. You can follow this image. You can also breathe at your own pace. It is your choice. But just to ground ourselves into the space and regulate and kind of let the outside world go so we can focus. Thank you. And then I just want to take the opportunity to kind of learn who all is in the space with me today. There is 74 of you, so you can also put it in the chat as well. But if you could please either unmute and share or put in the chat an introduction for yourself, your name, role and job. And then I always like to ask about level of presence because we all have a lot going on in our lives, as well as one thing that brings you joy. Looks like we have school counselor and books. I don't get enough time to read, but I do really love books as well. Dean, flowers and plants. Exercise. I over the another school social worker that makes me very happy. I over the pandemic started running because it was the only way I could get a break from my children, which sounds really terrible, but you know, it was a lot of time indoors working while distance learning. We have knitting and family, folks from all over the place, which is great. Baths, I love it. Right. Sitting in front of the fire. Fires are one of the only positive things I find about cold weather in the winter. I love fire season, both outdoors and indoors, so I'm with you on that one. Right, well, welcome everybody. And I don't know if everybody had a chance to introduce themselves, but feel free to keep adding it. But for the sake of time, I'm going to keep us moving. I'm excited to be with you all today. Today we're going to talk about trauma, and this is one of my favorite quotes when I think about trauma. With trauma comes hope, and this quote says, "Hope is a verb with its shirt sleeves rolled up." That's by David Orr. And I think that's really important to think about because when we start talking about trauma, it can feel really hopeless and it can feel really heavy. And one of the symptoms of trauma is a sense of hopelessness. And hope is one of the most powerful ways to combat that. And it's a very active verb, and it's really powerful. And so I want us to just kind of think about that quote as we go through, because even with all the hardships and stress and things going on, there is hope. And that is one of our responsibilities as people who support many people who are going through a lot of things in their life. To bring hope is a crucial role. So trauma, we're going to first start with asking, what is it exactly? And there's a lovely image of somebody with a brain, because it all comes back and focuses on the brain. So trauma results from an event or series of event or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so this is a really dry definition, but as we dive into it, one thing that I've noticed in just the history as we're learning more and more and more about trauma is it impacts, and toxic stress impacts all aspects of our being and our social beings. And it isn't just this one really small group of folks impacting in one way. It's kind of an all-encompassing situation. So it all comes down to the brain and the stress response system. And so on the slide right now, you'll see a picture of the brain, because the way the stress response system works is that it notifies your brain and body when there's a challenge or threat. So that's what gets kicked into gear when something's going on. And messages run up from the body through the brainstem, the diencephalon, limbic system, and to the neocortex, and then it runs back down. And when your brain is developing, your brain develops from the bottom up and inside out. So it develops in that same line and system as that I just described. And also messages that we're trying to communicate to each other also follow that same order. And then your brainstem, that is your reptilian brain. That's the least complex part of your brain. That's your heart rate, survival, fight, flight, freeze response, your survival brain. Then as you move up and you get into the diencephalon, you're looking at your coordination and movement, your physical needs, hunger, sleep, those basic needs. And then in the limbic system, that's where we manage our emotional response and our relational connection. And then once you get through there, you get up to the most complex part of the brain, which is your empathy, self-control, literacy, critical thinking, and that's in your cortex. And so me thinking right now, looking at this picture of a brain and trying to explain it, I'm thinking with my cortex, but the message before it comes out my mouth goes through my limbic system, through my diencephalon, through my cortex, out my mouth, and then it goes in through your ears, and then it goes up that same path. It goes through your reptilian or survival brain, diencephalon, limbic system, and then it will get to your cortex. So anytime we have any messages or any sort of communication, it gets filtered through the lower parts of our brain before it will get to kind of the smartest, most complex part of our brain. So if we're feeling dysregulated, or if we're emotional, or we're hungry, that's how messages kind of can get disoriented. And that's really important as educators to understand that. There's a reason why hangry happens. When you're angry, you get angry when you're hungry, because it's really connected to your limbic system. And that's going to change the way we take in and give out information. And so all of this really comes down to stress, and stress can be positive, as it shows on the slide, in brief increases and mild elevations of stress hormone levels. That's what motivates us. That's what allows us to be able to pull an all-nighter, to be able to rise to a deadline. And when we know that it's going to be in a dose and we're going to be able to manage it, it's a very functional. And then when we go through periods of longer high stress situations, they can still be tolerable. It might be serious, but if we know that it's temporary and stress responses and it's buffered by a supportive relationship. So if I know, let's say I lose someone, I'm going through a grieving period, the stress is going to increase, but I have my community I can lean on, I can feel confident, hopefully that I will feel okay again, that I'll recover and that I'll heal, and it's all buffered by my relationships, that becomes tolerable. And when stress becomes toxic, it's when there's a prolonged activation of stress in your stress response system, and you don't have the necessary protective relationships. There's an absence of those relationships. And so that's when stress starts to become toxic. And so when the types of trauma that we're looking at are what most people think of, which is simple or single incident trauma, type 1. This is what is diagnosed often as PTSD. It's when there's a single or isolated event that occurs in the context of relative emotional and physical safety, and it is diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. So this would be kind of a one-time situation. Obviously, there can be multiple incidents that happen, but like a car accident or an assault, something that kind of a one-time thing, and then you're able to return to a sense of safety afterwards. There's also, which is not easily diagnosable currently, complex or developmental trauma that as we learn more about the brain, we're learning more and more about. It's also referred to as type 2. And this is when somebody lives in an environment of maltreatment or neglect or toxic high stress for a long time. So ongoing, unrelenting negative experiences. It's generally very chronic and it's interpersonal. It usually occurs during childhood. So if you think, if you're in a child growing up in a home where there's a lot of fighting or homelessness, chronic homelessness can lead to type 2 complex or developmental trauma. But what we've learned is that when you live in a high or toxic stress situation for long enough, you can have the exact same symptoms as a simple or single incident type 1 trauma as well. And this has often been overlooked in the past. And so with that, what we know is that more than just these one-off things like a car accident, people experience trauma through historical and generational trauma. This happens both through kind of the experience as well as they're learning more and more about epigenetics and the impact of our actual DNA. Racial trauma, family of origin, so things that are happening in the family as we're growing up, domestic violence, war trauma, community violence, living in an area that has a lot of violence, secondary trauma, and so that's something to be really mindful, working in a helping profession, as well as trauma in the refugee and immigrant populations on top of whatever else they may experience. Those huge transitions can also be complex, create complex trauma as well because of the prolonged high stress response. So when we are in, have a traumatic situation, or actually this is an example, the image on here is the window of tolerance. And so on our day-to-day life, we all have a window of tolerance. And that's about our emotional regulation. And so on any given day, we kind of go along and we have ups and we have downs. But as you see on the screen, there's 2 lines, and the squiggly line in the middle kind of stays within that window of tolerance. If you go out of that window of tolerance, you get into hyperarousal or fight and flight mode. And that's when we can become hypervigilant or aware, overly quick, or have really intense reactions. Because there's a lack of emotional safety, we can have really overwhelming emotions. That's our fight flight response. And then down below the window of tolerance is our hypoarousal or freeze and faint. And that's when people will shut down, have flat affect, disassociative, numb. It can be hard to think. People will just kind of disconnect and have feelings of shame. But on a normal day, we're going to generally, a lot of people will operate kind of within your window of tolerance with kind of high energy times, low energy times, and just kind of work your way through. What happens in a simple or single incident traumatic situation is that you're kind of going along, as you see along this yellow line in the window of tolerance, and you notice, like if you think about if you're on a plane and you're going to hit turbulence, right? The plane might start to shake, and the first response is going to be to freeze. Then your second response is to flock, because we're naturally social people. So for me, if it's really bad turbulence, I look at the other passengers, I look at the flight attendants to see if they're okay, because I get my cues from the other people around me. Then, and this doesn't really work as well with the example of turbulence, but let's say you stop, you look around, you see what's happening, how other people are responding to the current situation, and then you're going to try to flee. If through that assessment, you're like, okay, this isn't okay, our next impulse is then to flee. And that is when our stress response system shoots out of our window of tolerance and we go into a hyperarousal state. We try to flee. If we're not able to flee, if we're trapped, our next response then is to fight. And if we're not able to fight, there's a moment of, and I realize it isn't on the slide, but there's a moment of fright where you have your body and your brainstem, I mean, there's this realization, there's nothing I can do about this, that this is going to happen. And this happens a lot with assaults, when the victim has a realization, okay, this is what's happening. And how your brain and your stress response system responds to that is you shoot down below your window of tolerance. And this is when people will faint, they'll freeze, they'll disassociate, possibly have an out-of-body experience, but your brain starts to shut down so you don't have to fully experience what's about to happen. And so that's kind of the general trajectory when you're having a simple, there's nothing simple about it, but it's called a simple or single incident trauma. And when people have had this experience over and over again, what begins to happen is your window of tolerance gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's not like a physical thing in your brain that you can see getting smaller, but it's just that your learned experience of the world becomes less and less safe because you've had more and more dangerous experiences. So an example I like to use is that if you're sitting in a room and there's a loud bang outside and you have two people, and one person grew up in a relatively safe neighborhood and the other person did not, the person A might assume that it's a car backfiring or fireworks or whatever else, right, that's causing that loud bang, while person B's first assumption might be that it's a gunshot. And that's just because, and they'll have a response, they'll have more of a hyper arousal, more of a trauma response, because what they've learned throughout their life is that when there's a loud bang, it usually means danger, and it triggers your brain to think that way. So then this is with a window of tolerance, what complex trauma looks like. And this is what occurs in an environment of maltreatment or neglect. You can see on the screen, there's a picture of a couple fighting. So the picture of a man sleeping on the side of the street, chronic homelessness or food scarcity can cause this as well. And the line, you just, because you're never quite safe, you just kind of ride that top line of your window of tolerance all of the time without any respite. Your stress response system is constantly going. You don't necessarily have the relationships needed to buffer that huge amount of stress. That doesn't mean that you don't have really wonderful protective relationships, but there's so much stress that it's just not possible to buffer that amount. And you just ride on that line for a long time. And that's what creates complex or developmental trauma. So my first question is if folks have any questions about what I've talked about so far. I just kind of, it was like a very quick rundown of Trauma 101. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or if this all just makes sense. If you see examples of this in your work. Well then, Long, I think we're gonna go into breakout rooms. There is an activity to work for, to take a look at. And in this activity, you're gonna look at these different types of trauma and what they look like, and really think through for your organizations and the populations you work through, what are some examples of how this might show up or how this might impact the folks that you work with and the learners that you work with.
All right, thank you, Lucy. I've set up the breakout rooms already. I've also added the handout for the activity into the chat. So with that, we'll split into of about groups of 10 to 11. And so once I open all the rooms, you should see a message that pops up in front of you to join the room. Lucy, how long would you like these breakout rooms to be?
I think let's go with 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. All right, and then once we get close to time, I'll send a message out to everyone and let them know that we're about to end the breakout room, so you know to finish up, and then I will then have everyone rejoin the main room. With that, does anyone have any questions really quickly before we start?
Long, could you remind everybody how to download the document that you put into the chat in case they're not familiar with that function?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Marcella. So if everyone should see the handout in the chat. There are 3 dots beside the file where it should have a W, and you can have an option to open the file or find in folder so that you should be able to access it. All right. With that, I will go ahead and open up the rooms, and we will convene back around 3:38. Lucy, everyone should be back now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I hope the discussions went well. I was wondering if some folks from the other groups or my group as well, if you would be willing to share some of the things that came up in your discussion, some examples. You can put it in the chat too.
Yeah, I don't know what number of group that I was in. I'm Marcus Antonio from Washington. I serve at the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. We talked about a variety of things, specifically touching on more complex and historical and racial traumas. I know for Washington, we are looking at receiving our Afghan brothers and sisters here, very soon in our community. We also talked about the opioid pandemic out in one of the sister states, really ravaging their community. We also talked about how we are faring during the pandemic, right? This chronic time of really working, knowing it's a pandemic, living through the pandemic and still providing instruction services, resources, and that whole gamut. So these were just some of the topics that we talked about in my group.
Thank you. Are there some other examples from other groups? Those are great examples.
Lucy, we do have some people adding to the chat about what their groups discussed.
Mm-hmm. Let me just take a look. So we have sexual assault, homelessness, veterans, refugees, underemployment, displacement, COVID. I think COVID was definitely an example that brought up in our group. We talked about that a lot. Some natural disasters, active shooter. And I think, and this is in the chat as well, but an important thing to point out is that in somebody's kind of experience in a year and a week, well, not necessarily a week, but in somebody's experience, they will have examples. Often it won't fit neatly into one category, right? So I worked in domestic abuse for a long time, both with survivors as well as people who've used abusive behavior, who are also generally survivors as well. And a lot of the examples would have been complex. They would have been dealing with a lot of different highly stressful, toxic stress situations throughout their childhood, abuse or being around abusive behavior while they're growing up, chronic, whether it's regular homelessness or instability, food scarcity, things like that, acute traumas, maybe they themselves had been hurt or assaulted, or and usually there would have been multiple examples of that. And then often kind of racial and intergenerational trauma as well. And that will be that's a very common experience, unfortunately, in our country. And so I think it's important to really understand that it isn't kind of one or the other. A lot of people will have chronic and complex trauma and racial trauma, and then on top of it, multiple experiences of acute or single incident trauma as well. And that, from a clinician standpoint, as a trauma therapist, that was some of the hardest cases to treat, because the whole point of processing through and going through the stages of healing for traumas, you're working towards a felt sense of safety. And when somebody's never felt safe before, it's very hard to get there. And then when you're looking at racial and intergenerational trauma as well, when they're not going to necessarily feel safe all the time, that adds a whole other layer, right? Because society is not safe for them. And so how do you help folks heal when they're still in a very unsafe environment? So thank you for those examples. when you're working with folks who've experienced trauma, there's some core experiences that are really important to hold kind of true when you're thinking about how to respond, because every case is different, everybody's experience is different, but generally speaking, with trauma, there comes a sense of disempowerment, helplessness, disconnection, a feeling of repetition or feeling stuck in the past, particularly when they're experiencing intrusive thoughts or nightmares, and a lack of choice. When people have been traumatized or have been through trauma, there's this sense that they don't have any power or autonomy or like choice over their life. And so when I'm working, well, just with anybody really, I'm really trying to think about ways to kind of counteract those experiences and just in my interactions, right? So like, instead of saying, go do this, say, would you like to, write right now or read, like giving two choices, or really trying to support people's own voice and choice and their sense of an internal locus of control as much as possible, and reminding them that they're in the current, in the now, and in a safe situation, just through sharing my calm. And we'll talk about some of that more as we go along. Another really key piece, so what you'll see on your slide, the squares with the arrows pointing down, these are the 4 aspects of a trauma-informed organization or program as defined by SAMHSA. And so, and the way that they define it is that you need to realize the widespread impact of trauma. You need to be able to recognize, it's a program that recognizes the way in which it's impacting and the signs and symptoms. Having skills and knowing how to respond, and then resisting, this is the 4th R, re-traumatization. So avoiding creating a circumstance where you may re-traumatize somebody. And so we just talked about some of the widespread impact or the way that it is impacted, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. But some of the signs that you need to be able to recognize as you're working with folks in your programs are kind of on your screen. And these are different trauma symptoms that range from, you have kind of more lower depressed symptoms like hopelessness, decreased concentration, insomnia, numbness, disassociation. A lot of these are kind of on that bottom, below your window of tolerance, all the way to like hyper aroused, which is where you're going to see intrusive memories and a startle response, panic attacks, irritability. People are going to be a lot snappier, substance use, a lot of self-destructive behaviors, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, shame, self-hatred. And I think that this is an important thing just to like look at and reflect, because people don't present just in one way, and it can really be all over the place. And one thing that happens a lot is that because it doesn't fit kind of our preconceived notion of how trauma or toxic stress impacts somebody, we don't realize that that's what we're working with. And it just seems like somebody who's being kind of rude or mean or manipulative or, or disinterested or aloof, when it's actually a symptom of the trauma that they've experienced. And not everybody is impacted by trauma differently. So what determines the effect of trauma is not the event, although there are some events that are so extreme that they're likely to traumatize most people, but not every individual who experiences an extremely stressful event will actually be traumatized, because it's a mix between the exposure to the traumatic event, your own mental health, kind of where you were at before you had that experience, and then all the risk and protective factors in your life. And this ranges from your relationships, your basic needs and how they're being met, your experiences before that. Have you been in a safe situation before that? Are you able to return to safety? Are you going back to a safe situation afterwards? And so it's this very complex web. And a lot of people, one thing I've heard a lot, unfortunately, when I've done a lot of consulting work, is they'll be like, oh, well, that wasn't that big of a deal. It shouldn't have impacted them that way. Or I can't believe, it didn't impact, they must not have cared that much. And we really can't pass judgment on how something should or shouldn't impact somebody, because it's very complex, and it is impacted by their current situation, their internal situation, and their life experiences. And so then the question is, why is this important? And I'm assuming everybody here kind of thinks it's important, and that's why you logged on. But one of the big reasons why I think this is a huge theme is just over the last years, this came up in all of your groups, we've been in a pandemic. So people have been often living at the top of their window of tolerance throughout this whole period of time. And I have a graphic on here that I pulled, and I live in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, about a mile away from George Floyd Square. And it just shows the anxiety and depression spike for Black and Asian Americans after the police killing of George Floyd. And you can see a remarkable increase, whereas white folks kind of stayed on the same trajectory that they were on. Black and Asian Americans, BIPOC folks were dramatically impacted by this. And so between all of these things, on top of everything else going on in people's life, it's been a really tough year. And so what I want you to just do is take a minute and just reflect on what are examples of toxic stress people have experienced over the last year. And to really think about, how has this impacted you? Where and how have you felt this in your body? We usually feel trauma in our body long before we're aware of it in our mind. And that's because it lives in that lower part of our brain, which is more connected to our body than it is to our cortex. And then also just thinking about, how has this impacted your students? So if we can just take, it says 5 minutes here, but I'm concerned about time. So we're gonna take about 2 minutes to think about this. In the chat, people share that they really feel it in their shoulders and hives, deep pain in lower shoulder blades. I've also noticed, I don't know if anybody else has, but when I'm really feeling the work, particularly when I've experienced secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, it's like the world will start to get foggy. It almost impacts my vision, and everything feels darker and heavier. And I'll have a lot of headaches. Somebody just put migraines, and I'll get migraines. And also my stomach is some of the first things to act up. Dizzy spells. These are all really good examples. I remember one thing when I started doing trauma work that was really surprising to me with some of my first clients is how many of them experienced chronic pain. And a lot of them had injuries that hadn't healed. Like they would have, like I had this one woman I worked with, and she had sprained her wrist 15 years ago, and it still hadn't healed. And she was in a brace, but when your stress response system is in high gear all the time, your muscles in your body never have a chance to relax and to heal. And so she's had this forever, and people started thinking she was crazy and inventing it for attention. So those are some ways that when we're not looking at it through a trauma-informed lens, we can really start to do harm, because we put other meaning to people's behaviors and responses. Heartburn is a really good example. That is definitely something. And eye fatigue, screen fatigue, yes, that was a huge issue for me as well. So this really started, and many of you I'm sure have heard of this. This is kind of all over the place, but if you haven't, I always like to just mention it. But adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, this was a big study that was completed by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, where they looked at more than 17,000 participants from 1995 to 1997 and found a direct correlation between adverse childhood experiences and long-term health effects. And so according to the study, the higher your ACE score and the higher the risk of long-term health problems. And 61% of people that they surveyed across 25 states reported at least one ACE. And they look specifically in the realms that you can see in the image here around abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual neglect, physical and emotional, and household dysfunction. So mental illness, mother treated violently, divorce, incarceration, and substance abuse among the caregivers. And this was really groundbreaking in that it was the first thing that started linking that there's this bigger issue, just one, how prevalent adverse childhood experiences are and how they can affect somebody throughout their whole life. And they started, the results from this ACE study really started to frame the conversation around how, if you look on the left of the screen, there's a triangle there. And so when people are born, when they're first conceived, the first impact that they'll have is the impact of generational embodiment of historical trauma, because that can impact us down to a genetic level. And then as we're growing up, and this is still early childhood, your social conditions and local context, then your adverse childhood experiences, as I explained on the previous slide, and all of this will then can impact your neurodevelopment and potentially disrupt your neural development, which will then impact your social, emotional, and cognitive abilities and potentially lead to impairment, which will then lead to an adoption of health risk behaviors, which can cause disease, disability, and social problems, and eventually lead to early death, which this is always a very dark slide to talk about, but it kind of shows how all of these things are very interlinked. And what they found is with the adverse childhood experiences is that the lasting impacts have this very wide range from like physical health, such as traumatic brain injury, heart disease, diabetes, to mental health and depression, anxiety, PTSD, to maternal outcomes, so negatively impacting maternal health during pregnancy and right after pregnancy, STDs, chronic disease like cancer, substance use, as well as impacted graduation rates and education as well. One of the big critiques of this study is that it was generally looked at middle class to upper middle class white families in more suburban contexts. So in Philadelphia, they did the Philadelphia ACEs study where they actually expanded the original to look at community level adversity. So they looked at witnessing violence. So if you've ever seen violence around you, even if it wasn't a direct threat, they looked at the feeling of discrimination while you were growing up. Adverse neighborhood experiences, how safe you felt in your neighborhood, bullying, and then living in foster care along with the original ACEs as well. And they surveyed 1,784 adult participants in Philadelphia. And this group comprised a more socioeconomically and racially diverse urban population. And what they found is that 7 in 10 adults had experienced one original ACE, and 2 in 5 had experienced 4 or more of the original ACEs, and 40% of the participants had experienced 4 or more of the expanded community level ACEs. And this is significant because more than 4 ACEs means high risk. And this study, in my opinion, doesn't get enough attention. And so when you're looking at ACEs, you really want to think about them. And this quote I really like from Bruce Perry, although part of it is covered up, but that he talks about how 1/3 of adult educators are impacted due to adverse childhood experiences. I think it's like 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. And so you really want to look at the 3 realms of ACEs. And so then the diagram that it has is that you want to think about household ACEs, so how the household was growing up and currently, and what's happening within the family, what's happening within the community, that's kind of that roots area, and what violence, poverty, lack of food, and then also environmental. So climate crisis and natural disasters and other things that folks put up there are also within the realm of ACEs. And so what all this means for the classroom is that trauma in the classroom can take on a lot of different forms. And so when somebody is hyper aroused, you're going to see hypervigilance, inattention, hyperactivity, elopement. They might leave the classroom, panic attacks, emotional dysregulation. You might see students jumping at noises or having a really hard time focusing on the teacher, outbursts of crying or laughter, often inappropriate. And it's not them trying to be disrespectful, it's often a trauma response. And when hypo-aroused, you're going to see a lot of disengagement, work refusal, low mood, sleeping, loss of interest, irritability, panic attacks. You might hear about somatic symptoms. People may seem zoned out or shut down. They might be falling asleep and it might be hard to really wake them up, and just kind of refuse to work with other students or teachers. And this can really change from day to day and look very differently. I had a student that I worked with, and he would, in a day, go just kind of disassociate into a completely catatonic state. And then, you know, maybe an hour later, he had this kind of alter personality where he was, he would call himself the king of Jamaica. And people didn't, I know it kind of sounds funny, but he really was completely unaware of what was happening in his body. His brain was just completely shut down. And it can be really easy to label these things as disrespectful or unengaged. And one thing that we see a lot, especially with children, but I think across the board and on this like image, is that the symptoms of trauma and then ADHD overlap a great deal. And so the ways in which they overlap is that difficulty in concentrating, easily distracted, not listening, disorganization, hyperactive, restless, difficulty sleeping. And so this is why a lot of folks who have been through trauma and whatever type of trauma end up getting kind of put on a path through special education, which is where I worked, and will often get misdiagnosed as well. So the big question, and I talked about how hope is really important, and sometimes talking about this, hope can be hard to hold on to, is what do we do? And so I already shared with you that SAMHSA talks about the realizing, which we already talked about, and the widespread impact of trauma, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in students, families, staff, and others, and being able to respond by integrating the knowledge that you have and resisting re-traumatization. And so the way, when you're looking at your programs, that you really want to kind of focus on is creating a safe environment. And that's a high structure, high warmth environment. So if you see on the diagram, the y-axis is structure, the x-axis is warmth. And you really want to stay in that quadrant. So you want to make sure that you have transparency and predictability. You're offering choice when possible. And then the warmth comes in with strong relationships and trust and awareness of your own triggers and how you're going to respond to folks. And so if you don't have that structure, things can feel really unpredictable and unsafe. And if you don't have that warmth, they feel punitive and re-traumatizing. If you don't have either, you end up in this other category, which is just neglect. And it's hard to create a trauma-informed environment. So many of you are in charge of, programs, and some things that you really want to pay attention to is to make sure that everyone in your organization is trained. I've done a lot of consulting for organizations trying to be trauma-informed and healing-centered. And it's not just the folks that are working directly. You need to make sure your reception staff, maintenance workers, educators, leaders, everybody is trained on what trauma is, how it shows up, and then also the impact of secondary traumatic stress, because that impacts how we respond to people. Because you never know when somebody's going to need support and who's going to be the one to be there to support them. You also really want to think about your programs and walk through them from the perspective of the students or clients or learners that you're serving. What does it feel like when they make that first phone call? Do they know what to expect at each point as they work through your program? Is there somebody there to greet them at each point? How does the physical space look? And looking at it from a trauma-informed lens, can people sit with their backs to the wall? And what are they sitting on? Like, is it clear how they can get their needs met at each point? and looking at fidgets and snacks, calming sounds that are visually appealing for folks. A lot of people really need to have stay in the here and now, and so your senses are really important. Sorry about that. And so these are some of the things you want to think about. Are there fidgets? Are there things they can listen to? Water, ways for them to take care of themselves. And you really want to think about how, following Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is on the screen right now. So are there resources to support their physiological needs and their safety needs? Is there friendly and regulated staff at each point? And is there time to take the time to get to know everyone? Because you need to meet these lower levels before you're able to get up to the point of self-actualization and really focusing on the strengths. So we have, I just said a bunch of different stuff. We have about 10 minutes left, and I was hoping to hear from everybody just a little bit. We're not going to break into discussion groups because we don't have time for that, but what are ways in which your organization has created structure for learners and educators? I'd love if you could unmute and share some of your own experiences. Don't all speak at once.
I can share. My name is Marie. I'm an ESL teacher in Wisconsin, and one thing that we do at our organization is make sure that we're touching base with students on an individual basis every week. So if a student is absent in class, does not come to class, someone is personally calling them and checking on them every single week to make sure that, you know, if they have any needs that aren't being met. And we do actually have a process for connecting them to local resources if we find that there is something that they're not getting outside of the classroom that they need to help them learn. So, thank you.
That's great. I'm happy to hear that. What are some other ways of,
We have a grant here at the YWCA where we are tasked with working with Syrian refugee women who have survived war and are replaced here in Connecticut. And we bring them in, we do some digital skills, we do a lot of English as a second language, but we also have wellness classes once a day for them that are women only so that they can feel really comfortable. And we do a lot of somatic experiencing. So yoga, Pilates, dancing, they really love it. But we make sure that once a month, we also have, they like to call it tea time because that's something that was part of their culture. They don't really get to do that with anyone except their tiny culture in the city here. And you know, there's their tiny community in the city here. So we expand it. We invite some of our seniors that are part of our fitness program. And it's lovely. They get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, they start baking, and they love to tell their stories about how they baked it. And then we use these little cards that have like pictures on them because the language, some of them really have no English. And we'll give them a question, they'll pick a card and we'll share it at our table. So we just try to create community so they can feel safe here.
that's great. And that's a really good example so that's both warmth as well as there's some predictability and structure. And really that was another big thing about one of the disconnections that happen with trauma is we disconnect from our bodies because often our bodies have been injured or harmed or put in physical harm. And so having ways that people can start to reconnect with their bodies. So reconnection is really like reconnecting with bodies, reconnecting with faith, reconnecting with relationships and the community. And so those are really great examples. We have something that's chat about instruction and routines were very beneficial for my students, helped create that sense of structure and predictability. That's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that. Because when we don't have a structure, we don't know what to expect, right? And so that does not, when there's not structure, predictability, and transparency, our stress response systems never regulate. We're not able to regulate enough to be able to access our limbic system, to be able to think straight, right? To be able to build those connections. And that really makes, same with like rhythm can be really helpful and help with regulating. So the dance example was good as well. What are some other, and also what are some barriers for being able to do this that you've all found? All right, we have in the.
We do have a few responses in the chat.
Yep, I'm just reading them, and it sounds like they write on the board what they can expect every day, which is a really good thing to do. So people can come in and immediately check. And also when somebody's feeling triggered, that can sometimes be really grounding to just take a look and to be able to be like, this is where I am right now. And then somebody else shared that they're offering professional development once a month for staff and they've focused on the last 2 months for SEL for students and staff as well. And part of my job is social emotional learning. And so I think I'm a big believer in that. So these are some really good examples. What are some of the like barriers that you all have found?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I work for an adult education, and right now enrollment is really down in the high school classes, and most of, I would say probably 90% of students who come to adult ed have been severely traumatized at some point in their life, and are still suffering. And now our class sizes are 1 or 2 students. So no matter what a student does, no matter how much I work with teachers on SEL, it becomes overwhelming for them. It's like too much pressure, and I don't know how to get through it. We're losing students even when we only have 1 in a class.
Yeah, I think. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a big, and I work in a K-12 situation right now, but I know we're seeing it all over the place of how challenging it is, right? I do think one thing we overlook a lot, and there's just not enough time to dive into it because I could talk about it for like a full day long, but is to really think we really need to start with ourselves as well, and compassion fatigue, and really focusing on the staff. And maybe this is something that you're already doing. I don't want to make any assumptions, right? But one thing that can really happen is we really need to create this trauma-informed environment, right, is to share our calm. And one thing that I'm seeing a lot is because we're all going through it, right? The one thing with the pandemic is there's this shared trauma that is happening, that students and learners are coming into rooms with people who are supposed to create the structure and the calm, and we're highly stressed and traumatized as well, right? And so, and then things, I'm going to go off on a tangent and we don't have time for it, but there's this parallel process. So the way that we interact, students interact with us, is how we interact with our supervisor. And these dynamics can get paralleled all the way up and all the way down an organization, right? And so as leaders, I think it's really important, and when I've been in leadership roles, to really think about the way in which I'm interacting with the folks that I supervise is going to be parallel to how they're interacting with the people that they're working with as well. And that puts a lot of like pressure, but one of the best ways to buffer that pressure is through really caring for each other and building those relationships that help buffer through times of high stress. If you think back to that slide, right? The difference between tolerable and toxic stress is the protective factors in those buffering relationships. So not knowing more about your current situation, that would be one place that I would really look at to start. I could talk about that for a long time. I'm very aware of our time right now. And so if there is more questions, we just have a couple of minutes. And I want to give an opportunity if anybody has any questions.
Lucy, I'm going to ask everybody to put their questions in the chat while I just talk through a few wrap-up items. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to share with you that next month's webinar is going to be an overview of the U.S. naturalization test and USCIS adult education Adult Citizenship Education Program Development Guide. That'll be January 26th, 2022, which is very exciting, first one of the year. It will be held at the same time as this one, 3 p.m. to 4:15 p.m. Eastern, and we encourage you to register along, put the link to that in the chat. If you have any questions about next month's topic, the USCIS Adults Citizenship Education Program, we encourage you to put those in the chat as well. That'll help make sure that we're ensuring your needs so that we can address those in next month's topic. In next month's webinar. We had a quick question for you, Lucy. Do you have any quick tips for compassion fatigue so that Carla can be better for her students?
Yeah, I'm going to give you like a quick rundown. Marcel, you've heard my thing. I can talk about this for a long time, but I think one thing that's overwhelming is that we talk about burnout or compassion fatigue without defining it. And there's actually different things that you need different responses to it. So burnout, just as a quick summary, that's exhaustion. You have too much going on, too much work on your plate. You might need a vacation. You might need to talk to your supervisor about reallocation of responsibilities. That's burnout. It's exhaustion, and it can happen to people who are in the helping profession or not. Secondary traumatic stress is when you've heard a traumatic story and you actually get the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So you might have nightmares about what somebody else's traumatic experience. You might have flashbacks. This has happened to me a few times when I was working as a trauma therapist. It was like I actually had experienced what my client had experienced. And that you will often kind of need to ride it out. It's really like PTSD. You can actually diagnose with it. You might also need some extra support from a therapist or from whoever supports you in your own healing. Vicarious trauma is what happens when you've heard so many hard stories that kind of your belief in the world and your hopefulness starts to diminish. It impacts the way you're viewing the world. And this is really kind of a workplace hazard. It's hard to hear about these hard things without it impacting that. And so for me, what I've really found is you really want to think about self-care, it's not about just going to an hour yoga class, and that's fine. That's not going to combat every terrible thing happening in the world. It's not possible. But really thinking holistically, how am I nourishing myself and what do I need right now? I have a hard job. Part of this hard job is listening to these hard things, which is going to impact me. There's nothing wrong with that. And so what is going to feed me spiritually? What is going to feed me physically? Whether sleep or exercise or eating right? What is going to feed me socially? Who should I talk to? What is going to feed me intellectually and emotionally? And at what point might I need therapy or some extra support as well? One thing that I know is that I need to be really careful about what media I take in and how I structure my days, particularly in the pandemic. That leads some stability. And that also, if I'm watching news 24/7, I slowly spiral into a very dark place. And so I have to be super mindful about that. And then the last one is to think about section is moral injury. And that's when you are witnessing things that go against your personal morals so many times that it creates kind of a cognitive dissonance. And then you really need to re-examine what that situation is and why that's happening and if things need to be readjusted. So if you work in an organization that is actively going against your own personal moral code, you'll start to really feel that moral injury. So I hope that wasn't too doom and gloom and a little bit helpful, but I think it's helpful to really try to understand what you're combating because it's going to need different things.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucy. This has been, I've always loved listening to you talk about this, despite the doom and gloom a little bit. I know that a lot of the people who are on today's webinar might be interested in receiving technical assistance on this topic for teachers in their state. So I'm going to ask you, if you do fall into that category, to please reach out to us at training@links.ed.gov. And we will be able to get that get that to you. We can work with you to offer that. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And we will be in touch, and we hope you'll join us for our next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Yes, sorry, do you want, Wendy, I'll ask you to email me directly. All right, thanks again.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today's LICS event. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Marcella. Thanks, Long.
Thank you, everybody.
Security is everywhere.